Our guest this evening, of course, is Lanny Davis, who's no doubt familiar to many of you. He's been a prominent Washington lawyer for decades, one who specializes in crisis management. And as such, he's a co-founder and partner not only of a law firm, Davis, Goldberg, and Gulper, but also a public relations firm, Trident DMG. Lanny helps clients develop communication strategies as well as litigation strategies to handle problems, and he's often appeared on camera and in print as a spokesman for his clients. Among those he served over the years have been Bill and Hillary Clinton, whom he met in law school. And during the Clinton administration, Lanny served as a special counsel to the president and was a White House spokesman on matters concerning campaign finance investigations and other legal issues. His own involvement in politics predates even those White House years, stretching back several decades to the 1980s when he served on the Democratic National Committee representing Maryland. And not all his service has been at the bidding of Democrats. In 2005, George W. Bush appointed Lanny to the 5-member Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board created by Congress as part of the Intelligence Reform Act. Lanny's several previous books have dealt with his own specialty area, that is scandals and lessons in crisis management. And his new work, The Unmaking of the President 2016, delves into what he considers the biggest scandal of the most recent election, namely how James Comey, then the FBI director, cost Hillary Clinton the presidency. More than Hillary's own campaign mistakes or Trump's successful sloganeering, more than the Russian meddling, Lanny makes the case that what tilted the election was Comey's letter to Congress on October 28, announcing the discovery of a laptop computer belonging to Anthony Weiner and containing thousands of copies of Hillary's emails. Before then, Hillary was ahead in the polls, especially in key battleground states. Afterward, a significant number of voters appeared to swing away from Hillary and toward Trump. Lanny brings a lot of statistical analysis, as well as some other fresh material to his dissection of the Comey affair. And for good measure, he concludes the book with a robust discussion of impeachment and the 25th Amendment. Although he says he is opposed to the removal from office unless it becomes a last resort and is bipartisan. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Lanny Davis.
First, holy mackerel, I did not expect 1/4 of this number of people, so thank you all for coming out on a holiday night, and especially to hear me talk about this book. I would like to introduce two special people, one of whom can explain how George W. Bush came to appoint me to something. The first special person who lived through the writing of my book, as she has all of my other books and projects and obsessions for 33 years, is my wife, Carolyn, who's somewhere in the back of the room. Wave. And sitting to the left of Carolyn is my Yale College for 1 year roommate, Bob Kenny, who was all Ivy League, split end for Yale, but never mind that. We were fraternity brothers in Delta Kappa Epsilon, which at Yale is a social fraternity. You don't live there. You live in a residential college. In our residential college of Davenport and at Delta Kappa Epsilon was somebody named George W. Bush. I voted for George W. Bush for president of Delta Kappa Epsilon. And I told him, we stayed friendly through the years, I told him that I am proud that I voted for you for president of DEEC, but I never would have voted for you and didn't vote for you for president of the United States. But we did remain friends, and this particular board that he appointed me to was created by Congress to try to protect our civil liberties in an age of counterterrorism techniques. So we were supposed to be the watchdog, and it was a pretty interesting experience. So let me talk a little bit about my book. I would like to reserve at least one half of the time that you're nicely here to listen to me. I would like to hear your questions and your comments about the election. I don't know how many of you here are still grieving or some of you may actually support Donald Trump. I don't know how many. There may be a few. But I will tell you the story of how I wrote this book, because it will give you insight into what the book is about. I didn't decide I wanted to write a book and begin doing research. That's the way the last 3 books that I wrote. I decided this was a great topic when I was at the White House to explain how I learned crisis management in the cauldron of the Clinton White House, where there were absolutely no crises to learn from. No, you know. And that was my first book. And the mantra of the crisis management advice that I now give to clients, I developed in the Clinton White House and wrote as the subtitle, "Tell it early, tell it all, tell it yourself." That's what you do in a crisis, is get the truth out, even if it's bad news, quickly, yourself. It's a pretty obvious rule that everybody violates. The next book I wrote, which almost nobody read other than my family and my editor, was called Scandal: How Gotcha Politics is Destroying America. I wrote that in 2010 as I saw the first 2 years of the Obama administration. The polarization in the country was getting so bad that I just wanted to try to convince people there was a purple center that we needed to unite about with this great president that we had just elected, this historic president. And so I wrote a book about the need for a broad center in American politics, and nobody read it. Very few people read it, but it was an important book. And then the third book I wrote was just true life stories about what it's like to be a crisis manager, from advising Martha Stewart, who called in the middle of the night, woke us up, and I said to Carolyn, "Who is that on the phone calling at 2 o'clock in the morning?" I said, "It's Martha Stewart." And she mumbled something, I think, Carolyn, "Why is she calling at 2 o'clock in the morning?" But I knew that she was in trouble, and from that point on, I told all these stories about my real-life crises. And that was a fun book to write, and it didn't do too badly in a particular slice of life of people who worry about crisis management. So on this book, I did not want to write this book, did not think about writing the book, because I was in grief. And the black night of November 8th, Carolyn and I were in the hotel at the Peninsula in New York, all prepared to go to the center with the glass ceiling at the Javits Center, ready to see my old law school friend, whose name was Rodham when I first knew her, to become the first female president. And there was no doubt in anybody's mind, although over the weekend I was getting jittery at the closing in the Battleground states. That was obvious to anal people like me who watch every poll published anywhere in the country. I used to be an amateur pollster, and I am very obsessed about the polling methodology, good ones and bad ones. And so I was getting nervous. And of course, after the shock of the notion of Donald Trump actually being the president-elect, I buried myself in what else? Data. I started looking not just at the horse race results, Clinton versus Trump. When did it begin? How did it start? How did it continue? Where did the deterioration occur? I went into counties. I went into congressional districts. And wherever I could find the data, I went below the level of the headlines. I wanted to know not only who was ahead and who was behind, but I wanted to know other polls that aren't published. There's a lot of polling done by marketing organizations when they're testing whether Kraft cheese is good or bad. They will stand in front of supermarkets and they will ask people like us who are coming out, "How do you feel about this Kraft cheese? Do you like the taste?" And these kinds of marketing sampling is very accurate, because people don't lie about whether they like the cheese or not unless they think they're trying to get some free cheese. So the really accurate polls, the ones that have been time-tested in lots of different mathematical ways, are the emotional questions, not who are you going to vote for. People sometimes lie, and some people think that people lied about their Trump support because they were embarrassed. So I wanted to avoid getting data that people would question as, well, polls aren't accurate. So I started to look at the emotional data. And then I went into almost a state of shock as I realized what I was seeing. The morning of October 28th, 2016, the morning, I looked at about 150 polls that were taken the night before on the 27th into the morning of the 28th and published 2 days later, but they ended approximately noon on the 28th. Every single poll, not one exception, showed Hillary Clinton winning by a landslide on the morning of the 28th. Now just think, as I end my book with a quote, right before the impeachment chapter, the last chapter is chapter 8, where I explain this data, I found a quote that summarized what I realized, which is all of the mistakes, the emails, the server, the notion that there were people who were deplorables for Donald Trump that hurt her in rural working class areas. The fact that she was a woman, hello, men using a different standard. Bernie Sanders was passionate while he was shouting. Hillary Clinton screeched while she was shouting. Do they ever use the word screech about a male? I don't think so. Add it all up. Her fainting at the 9/11 ceremony hurt her terribly. She dipped way down for about 24 to 48 hours, not only because she looked so frail and that caused people to be concerned, but she handled it so badly. How long did it take for her to admit she had pneumonia? It was just as if everything piled up, mistake, 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 against one of the worst, most dangerous candidates that could ever be imagined. She was still winning by a landslide on the morning of the 28th. Add all those mistakes up, all her errors and all her weaknesses as a candidate. She was winning by a greater margin than Barack Obama defeated Mitt Romney. And Barack Obama was a pretty darn good candidate, a gifted candidate. So, what happened? If that's where she was on the morning of the 28th, where was she on October 30th on feelings questions? So let me just give you one example of that. And I remember this moment because that's the moment I decided to go up and see Hillary before she had to sit behind the podium and watch Donald Trump be inaugurated, which I could not believe she was actually going to manage with billions of people watching her face. I came across this data. So on October 28th in the morning, she had finally reached a 50-50 ratio in a question asked in almost every poll taken anywhere. Do you have a favorable or an unfavorable impression of blank? Donald Trump was negative on that question 2-1 or 3-1 for his entire campaign. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, was 70-30 on that question. Almost unheard of. She had a majority of Republicans when she was Secretary of State saying they had a positive impression of her. Then after Benghazi, she started to get much narrower, and she was 60-40 positive, meaning a lot of partisanship was hurting her in the Benghazi period of time. Then as she started running for president, she stayed in the high 50s positive to negative. And then on March 3rd, 2015, what happened? Anybody remember? You shouldn't, but the New York Times front page story with the following headline. I am sorry if anybody's here from the New York Times. I love the New York Times, but this is when it all began. Clinton uses private email system, possibly violating the rules. The word possibly in a headline. Just think about it. It's not a fact if it's possible. It means we don't know whether it's legal or... But the headlines all over the country, following the New York Times, created headlines that she had done something illegal. So from that date, March 3rd, 2015, her positive and negative ratio started to go smaller and smaller. And then in July of 2015 came another New York Times headline, Hillary Clinton under criminal investigation for emails. And as I tell the story in my book about that particular story, it turns out they were right. There was a criminal investigation by the FBI opened 2 weeks before that nobody knew about, but they were wrong in sourcing it to an inspector general, and they had to publish a retraction that they got the story wrong, even though months later they realized they actually got the story right. They just attributed it in the wrong way, and I have fun writing that chapter, I interviewed both reporters who were very angry with me until I said, you wrote a story based upon a leak from a Republican staff member who mischaracterized a memo from the Inspector General. Reminds you of All the President's Men and that mistake that Woodward Bernstein made with Hugh Sloan, whether he told the grand jury or not. Well, it was a similar kind of incident. But my point about what caused me to go up to see Hillary Clinton is when I looked at the positive-negative ratios that were very negative for Hillary Clinton from those email stories all the way until October 2016. And then I noticed day by day in October, she was creeping up towards a 50-50 ratio, which she hadn't had since that evening of March 3rd, 2015. And on lucky me, because I was looking for her to actually show a positive, October 26, 2 days before the Comey letter, 4 major national polls were published. One of them, the USA Today poll, another ABC, Washington Post, very, very highly respected polls. On that question of positive, negative impression, she was at 50-50. Best she had been in 15 months. Then on October 28th at 1 p.m., James Comey has his letter published that he sent to Congress. And then, using my little cursor on Real Clear Politics, I tracked that question, October 28th, October 29th, 30, 31. In 3 days, she's 2-1 negative. Nothing happened but Comey's letter. And according to the Harvard Shorenstein Center, that hired 60 or 100 young people to watch every television show and read every newspaper for the last 10 days of the campaign and rate the reporting on tone, either positive or negative, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. 95% of the last 10 days, Hillary Clinton negative in the media, 24/7, every major newspaper in the United States. Is there any wonder that not only did the positive negative go off the cliff and she was 2-1, 3-1 negative within days, but her poll numbers started to collapse. And there was one special study as to where was the collapse coming from and for what reason. There's something in polling called a panel study. Normal polling is random sample of 1,000 people across the country. Everybody has an equal chance of being selected. Whatever the results are will be plus or minus 3%. That's a mathematical principle. And that's the way most polls are conducted, random sampling, different 1,000 people in every poll. But a panel study uses the same people. They're selected randomly, and then every 2 weeks they're asked, who are you for? How do you feel? And the same group of people will answer. And you notice movements within the same group of people. So happily for me, as I was doing this research, there was a sample of this panel that had been the same all year long, showing Hillary Clinton ahead of Donald Trump. And on October 28th, in this particular sample, she was ahead 6 points. In Real Clear Politics, the average of all the polls for the last week, she was ahead 6 points. That was in the morning. And then, of course, she started to drop down after the Comey letter was first sent and the media went so negative. Well, within this particular panel from the University of Pennsylvania, the individuals who were showing movement were what were described as soft Democrats, that is, people who had reported in their interviewing that they had voted Republican in past elections, so they weren't partisan Democrats, were falling off of Hillary and going into the undecided column. Undecided voters were falling from undecided, leaning to Trump. And as each day progressed, more and more movement was going from soft Democrats for Hillary to undecided, and undecided to Trump. Each day, and the total switch going on in this panel ended up being a collapse of about 6 to 8 percentage points within a week. And then I looked finally at Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which broke my heart. Because in those 3 states, which, by the way, are purple states, they're color blue on the map because we are accustomed to seeing them blue in presidential elections. Wisconsin has a Republican governor. Michigan has a Republican legislature. Pennsylvania, for goodness sakes, is all red except for Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. It's hard for a Democrat to win in Pennsylvania, but we've done it every 4 years in the presidential campaigns. And so we all expected those 3 states to be our way. And on the morning of October 28th, Hillary Clinton was winning those 3 states by 6 to 8 points in every poll taken up to that point. And then after the Comey letter, in the rural areas, the red areas, the working class areas, is where she started to drop, because those are the soft Democrat undecided voter areas. And then the final result in those 3 states, 0.7% difference in Pennsylvania, 0.7% difference in Wisconsin, and 0.2% in Michigan. When you look at the Comey letter results, before Comey and after Comey, it is simply mathematically impossible not to conclude that but for James Comey's letter, she wins those 3 states, and she's president of the United States, and we're not all sitting here, how did we get this man in the White House? That is not a probability statement, which is the way I originally titled this book, How James Comey Probably Cost Hillary Clinton the Election. And every time I looked at that word probably, because Nate Silver in 535 wrote in May of 2017, Comey's letter probably cost Hillary Clinton the presidency. And I tried to convince myself that there wasn't a certainty here until I looked at Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. There's simply no way that she could lose 6 to 8% in 1 week and lose those states by that margin without Comey being the reason. And so, as you'll see when I write my last chapter, I did not use probably. In all likelihood, I said he cost her the presidency. So to finish my story, how I decided to write this book. Having finished all this research, I had no book in mind other than anger at James Comey and try to figure this guy out, because I didn't see him as a partisan. I just saw him as a narcissist who thought he could do things his way, violate every Justice Department rule. Going back 75 years, you're not allowed to do anything 60 days before an election. If you're a member of the Justice Department, if you're a prosecutor, you're not allowed to indict, you're not allowed to arrest, you're not allowed to do anything when there's a pending presidential election. That goes back to Dwight Eisenhower. But James Comey decided, I can do it, because I want to cover my flank with the Republicans, because they've discovered these Anthony Weiner emails, and Hillary's going to win anyway. Hillary's going to win anyway, is what was said in the room on the evening of October 27th. I became a reporter. Kind of fun to talk to people on, quote, deep background. I won't report you what you're telling me, but how did you guys decide to send this letter, knowing you were violating every rule going back 75 years, and you just might elect this individual president of the United States? Why did you guys do this? I did try to get to talk to James Comey, and he refused to let me interview him. But I talked to people this far from him that critical evening when they decided to send this letter. And the answer was, he knew that if there was any emails that had classified markings, that could be a criminal case, and he wanted to be sure. Well, why did he have to write Congress? Why didn't he go look and decide whether anything was there before he wrote Congress and possibly caused the election of Donald Trump? Answer, are you kidding? We never thought there was a chance Donald Trump could get elected president. James Comey himself said, if Sally Yates or Loretta Lynch, who was recused, you'll remember why, if Sally Yates wants me to not send this letter, tell her to pick up the goddamn telephone and order me not to. Direct quote from my source. Guess what? Sally Yates was meeting the people I interviewed in both rooms. People in the Sally Yates room were all saying, he's not going to send a letter that violates 75 years of Justice Department policy. He hasn't even looked at the emails. Let him go look at the emails. Oh, well, that would require a warrant, and that would leak because the New York City FBI office was called Trumpland and filled with Hillary Clinton-hating FBI agents, which is funny to hear Trump describe the FBI as pro-Hillary Clinton, right? So they said, why should we give Jim Comey the ability to grandstand that we ordered him not to send this letter, will be hauled up in front of a congressional committee accused of obstruction of justice. So Sally Yates said, the heck with it. There's no chance Donald Trump's going to be elected president. That's the second time that day somebody made that sentence. One in Comey's room, one in Sally Yates's room. And then there is another place where that sentence occurred. The address, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I do not blame Barack Obama for the decision he made. I would have made the same decision. He decided, not lightly, because there was a debate. Do we go public with what we know about what Russia is doing in this election to help Trump? To help Trump. Every time you hear media describing Russian meddling, it wasn't just Russian meddling. It was Russian meddling to help Trump. Barack Obama knew that. Every intelligence agency told him that. They had live voices that they were listening to in a foreign accent, sounding very much like Russians, describing what they were doing to help Trump. All they needed to do was hold a press conference with the president walking into the press room and saying, Mr. Putin, I know what you're doing, and I'm going to tell the American people what you're doing, and we're going to start sanctioning you today. That could have been in September 2016, with every intelligence agency head backing him up, and I think the election would have been over had that happened. Why did President Obama not do that? A very good reason. Donald Trump had psyched him out by using the word, they're rigging the election, they're rigging the election, they're rigging the election. So Barack Obama didn't want to give Trump the demagoguery of that expression all over again. And he also said to a close assistant, Hillary's going to win anyway. Now just think of the tragedy of those three great power centers in American institutions, the White House, the senior office in the Justice Department, and the FBI director, making decisions or non-decisions because everybody thought she's going to win anyway. So I went to New York 3 days before I've asked permission to tell this story from my old friend Hillary Rodham. I have a hard time remembering that she changed her last name. And I went up to see her in a nice little quiet office after all of the hullabaloo. There she was sitting by herself behind a desk with one receptionist. When I got into the room, I was feeling rather down still in grief. And the first thing she said is, "What's wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with, are you all right?" I'm fine. You're the one who looks terrible. What's going on?" I said, "Well, I've just spent the last 2 months doing research, and this is what I came up with." And I told her almost to the word what I've just told all of you. When I was done, and I really focused on the feelings changed, because that really did hit her the way it hit me. People don't lie about that question on impressions. They might lie about who they're voting for, but that one, the switch in 3 days from 50-50 to 2-1 negative right after Comey, really I could see physically her react. And then she said, "You've got to write that book. I can't write that book. They'll think I'm blaming Comey. You've got to write that book." And I said, "I don't want to write that book. I'm done. I'm trying to get out of my grief." And I realized, as a matter of history, without in any way dismissing, as she didn't that day dismiss, and when she went on her book tour, she didn't dismiss that she made lots of mistakes. I wanted history to know that she would have been president of the United States but for one man, an appointed official, who was so full of himself, so filled with his need to protect his political flanks, that he did something that violated all the rules, which was a firing offense. So my closing line to you is the way I started out my interview with Sean Hannity, and I never got a word in edgewise after that, is Donald Trump and I have one thing in common. What's that, Davis? What's that? James Comey should have been fired by Barack Obama, not to obstruct justice the way Donald Trump fired him. So that's how I came to write this book, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have or argue with me. Thank you. We have places for microphones for you to one over here, and this is our first.
First here.
Yes.
In Electoral College results, Hillary would have had to have carried all three of the industrial states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, to win. And I noticed the tabulation of pre and post October 28th polling in those three states. In Wisconsin, where I'm from, as of the 28th of October, she was ahead by 6.5 votes.
6.5%.
6.5%, I'm sorry.
Right.
On November 7th, she was ahead by 6.5. In Michigan, she dropped 5.5 points from October 21st to October 28th, 2.8% in the following week. So it seems to me, looking just at Wisconsin and probably at Michigan, it's hard to explain how she would have, how the result would have been different in Wisconsin, and if she'd lost Wisconsin, it would have been all over, no matter what happened elsewhere.
Well, first of all, the problem with any state poll, as opposed to national polls where you have regular intervals of polling, is that when you're in a state, sometimes you only have one poll.
No, this is the Real Clear Politics average, you said.
Right, and I'm quoting my own book, so I know what's there. So the dramatic change from the 7th to the 8th is actually misleading. She was sliding gradually according to local polls in all three states. But as I said earlier, she only lost by 0.7%, and that happened within a week. So if you believe the cumulative Real Clear Politics polls as of the 28th in the morning, that's a very significant lead for Wisconsin. And to lose that much in about 10 or 11 days must have been something. The number that you're looking at for Wisconsin, which is November 6th, there wasn't a poll taken. That was a Sunday. So the actual November 6th number that you're looking at there was an accumulation of one or two polls taken the previous week.
During the week.
So the logic of those three states is, let me just give you two facts and why I came to go from certainty from probability. Number one, Russ Feingold was ahead by about the same margin as Hillary Clinton 1 week out. And he dropped along with Hillary Clinton because the media was so negative about a criminal investigation that it depressed a lot of Democratic turnout in Wisconsin. When Hillary Clinton was accused of not campaigning in Wisconsin, and that you've heard that from a lot of people, Russ Feingold is one of my oldest best friends. I thought to myself, geez, that's funny. Russ Feingold campaigned every day in Wisconsin because he lives in Wisconsin. They're not accusing him of not campaigning in Wisconsin. That depressed vote that occurred in Democratic neighborhoods and in rural, undecided areas is where the slippage occurred in the three states. But let me give you one other statistic that's breathtaking. If you take those three big states, a total of 15 million votes were cast altogether. The difference between Trump and Hillary Clinton out of 15 million votes was 78,000. Nobody can tell me that before the Comey letter hit, she was way ahead. Right after, she starts dropping. That particular table won't tell you that because you're only looking at that last date where there were earlier polls. But 78,000 votes out of 15 million, do the percent. The movement of voters in the panel that I described were very clearly triggered by the Comey letter, was a lot more than 0.7%, 0.2% in those three states. Anyway, that's my case. But very good of you to read that table so closely. I thank you. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I always have to start out by saying that I'm not an American. I'm from the Caribbean. And I always say that because where you're from has a certain, and your background, I grew up in the Netherlands, has a certain influence on how you see things. Having said that, I am a little bit troubled by the notion of blaming Comey, and only Comey. I mean, she herself said she made a lot of mistakes campaigning, right? And it seems to me that one of the big problems with her loss, and I don't think we should only see her loss against Trump, but we need to see her loss against Obama, right? If she was really a good candidate, Obama would never have been president. I think she was a problematic candidate from the very beginning, and if she ran 2 or 3, 4 times, I mean, but the issue is that I think she had another big problem, right? The Democratic Party itself, right? Basically, let's start on the Clinton, but before Clinton, it's not only Clinton. I mean, the Democratic Party was moving, right? From a kind of a social democratic, a somewhat populist social democratic party, very, very conservative, but still somewhat social democratic, to basically a Wall Street type of party. With that, moving away from a lot of the poor people, one of the big problems she had is she couldn't, if the people who had voted for Obama came out, she would have won. Comey could do whatever he wants. The problem is what I'm saying is that there's an agenda problem here, ideological problem, a problem of presenting in a workable, energizing alternative to the American people. She didn't do that. The Democratic Party has not been doing that. And I think that is the major reason why they have been losing elections. That there needs to be a deeper thinking about what the party needs to do, who the party represents. How do you represent these ordinary working class people who are suffering in growing wealth and income divide, etc., the polarization of America? I mean, you know that as well as I know that. But I want to hear what you think about that.
Well, first of all, thank you for a well-expressed opinion and respectable opinion critiquing the Democratic Party, not just Hillary Clinton, but going to broader. So I thank you for offering that opinion. I only try to do facts, and the word blame is a characterizing verb. So I don't blame anything on Comey, but it sounds like I am. I state a specific statistical fact. He wrote a letter that violated Justice Department rules. Fact. It was a firing offense. Fact. After he wrote the letter, her poll numbers plunged like a rock in a pond of water. Fact. And I gave you the facts of the difference where she was winning by a greater margin than Barack Obama on the morning of October 28th over Mitt Romney. Fact. So two things can be true. Two facts can be side by side, contemporaneously true. Fact 1, she made lots of mistakes, had problems as a candidate.
Who hasn't made any
Right.
mistakes?
Which winning candidate do you remember the mistakes versus all the great things about Hillary Clinton? She won by 3 million votes. Terrible candidate. 3 million votes. Larger than Obama, larger than almost any Democrat or Republican. Terrible platform. Terrible working class connections. She was ahead by a landslide on October 28th among all those working class voters that we say she couldn't connect with. So something happened. It's a fact. But I think there's a criticism to be had for the way she handled her emails. From a crisis manager standpoint, she could have done better. The decision she made to use a private server, Colin Powell made that decision and got away with it. Oh, but he didn't have his private server at home. No, he just had it on AOL, which was hacked during the run-up to the Iraq War. That's called a private server. It was just owned by AOL, but it was hacked. There was no evidence of Hillary Clinton's server being hacked. So you can say she made lots of mistakes, was a weak candidate in many ways, and that's a fact. And you can also say that she's President of the United States on the morning of October 28th, and something happened to change that. That's also a fact. So I hate the word blame. I know I sound that way, and I don't blame you for that interpretation, but you can have both things being true at the same time. Yes.
I admire the heat that you've taken for the Clintons over the course of your crisis management career. However, if Hillary Rodham had chosen a standard secured government email, Comey would have never been a factor.
Correct.
What makes Hillary Rodham so special that she has to have a private email? I have heard speculation that it is to cover donations coming to the Clinton Foundation. Would you comment on it, please?
Yeah, I only do facts, not speculation. One speculation is good as any other, but you used the right word. She made the decision to use a private email system for the two reasons that Colin Powell gave to her when he advised her, and his email advising her came out in September 2016, and I quoted in my book. Reason number one, Colin Powell said, is privacy. You're not anybody. You're Hillary Clinton. Any email that you send to a friend or to anyone will be put on the front page of the New York Post, and I had the same problem, so privacy. And the other was convenience. She had a BlackBerry, and she didn't want to carry two BlackBerries. Was it a mistake? In retrospect, who's the first person to say she made a mistake? Hillary Clinton. Would she have won the presidency anyway but for Jim Comey? I say yes. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for being here, and
Thank you.
I'm sure your book is really intriguing in terms of Mr. Comey's effect on the presidency. You mentioned that the 50-50 split. I guess one of the questions I have addressed to you is how strong was that 50-50 split? Was it very strong? Was it meek? Was it a watered 50-50 first? Secondly, because she was the first female candidate that had a chance to win the presidency, I'm reminded of the Tom Bradley effect in California, where you needed to be more than 5 or 6% ahead of your opponent, because people would say one thing and then walk out by voting for someone else. And in a third type of an aspect, using your son's analogy, your son, since he's in the area of sports, I'm reminded of the Super Bowl game of Atlanta versus the Patriots, where Atlanta was up by this insurmountable lead, and yet
Talk about
the
pain. You're
Patriots,
reminding me I was rooting for Atlanta.
the Patriots come back because they recognized that the fourth quarter existed, where Hillary Clinton didn't realize that the fourth quarter existed. On October 28th, the election wasn't held until 10 days later. She didn't react to the fourth quarter.
Okay, well, the last point is simply a certainly perfectly respectable opinion. It's just belied by the facts. But opinions can sometimes change people's mind. If your opinion is strong enough, you look at the facts. I had the opinion that she was coasting towards the end, and all of us were. And had Sally Yates not been coasting, she would have picked up the phone and said to Comey, "Don't you dare," and we'd have Hillary Clinton as president. So there was certainly a coasting psychology in the Clinton campaign that we all look back on and say, oh my God, why didn't we know? But the fact is that she was substantially ahead with a very enthusiastic base of voters, not just women, but lots of Democrats. People who say that Bernie Sanders had all the passion. Take a guess how many more votes Hillary Clinton won in passionate, hardcore base voters primaries. 4 million votes more than Bernie Sanders. Who had the passion? Bernie Sanders was a great candidate speaking to his base and young people, God bless him. But Hillary Clinton had 4 million more votes than Bernie Sanders. So I don't buy the notion that she didn't have a passionate base on that 50-50 weak versus strong. But she had her problems as a candidate. Did Barack Obama had problems in especially the closing weeks of his campaign when Romney was closing very fast? He only won by slightly less than 4% over Mitt Romney, who is a damaged goods candidate. Every candidacy has problems. Hillary Clinton had many, and she's acknowledged it. But just remember, you can have two things true. All the criticisms of Hillary Clinton can be absolutely true. And James Comey cost her the election. Had he not written that letter, she would be president of the United States. That can also be true. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Before the next question, I just want to say we have 2 more here, and we have 3 more here, and then we'll have to call it at that.
Oh, can't we keep going? I mean,
Okay. Hi. One thing that I think has been overlooked is the very fishy circumstances that set the Comey letter in motion, which was, if you remember, a 15-year-old girl from North Carolina somehow getting the text information to sort of catfish Anthony Weiner, to set this all up again, one more fall from grace by him that then allowed these emails to be re-examined. When that story broke, her parents first said they had no political connection, and then it turned out they were both, deeply engaged in Republican politics. That has never been revisited, and I think that what we've seen with so many sort of Donald Segretti-like dirty tricks going through, certainly, Weiner was absolutely, a sitting duck for this kind of enticement, but I still have a great deal of skepticism that somehow this was a random 15-year-old girl, unassisted, making this connection that set the Comey
Peggy,
letter.
we can go crazy with these possibilities, and I certainly almost did writing this book. And I finally decided I could have tried to weigh in on that possibility. Rudy Giuliani, I did write a chapter, all fact-filled, no speculation, on the role he played in putting pressure on Comey to write that letter. He went on Fox on October 25th, 3 days before Comey wrote the letter, and said, "Something's coming, ha, ha, ha." And then on October 28th in the morning, he went on talk radio and said, "Active and former FBI agents are telling me something's coming." And whether or not this young woman with a very easy victim in Mr. Weiner, who had his own illness to be vulnerable about, there are so many what-ifs here that you can go crazy. The only way I could do this book is to try to deal in certainty while acknowledging all of Hillary's mistakes, because the word blame, I knew that the first, with all due respect to the gentleman with the great accent from all different places, I knew that whatever I said, and Hillary and I talked about the word blame, they're just going to say I'm blaming Jim Comey, and they're just going to say you're blaming Jim Comey. I said, I'm going to write a book, and I'm never going to use the word blame. I'm just going to say, here is a fact, and then let people say I'm blaming Jim Comey, and I'm prepared for the response. But Peggy, I think we have a fact, and that is that Comey, for narcissistic reasons, thought he could do something that was a violation of every rule. Why? Because he's Jim Comey, and he comes first. His integrity, the FBI's independence, and by the way, protecting his right flank among the Republicans in Congress. Who cares? He's going to win anyway. So that's where I ended up, but I could go nuts if I went through all those theories.
Okay.
But thank you. Good to see you. Yes, sir.
I wanted to divert just a second and ask you a broader question about the future of the Democratic Party. And I made some notes here, and I was wondering if you
I'll
could...
say oy vey if anyone here is Jewish, because I'm being asked about the future of the Democratic Party. And
But
I
I
just said oy
wanted...
vey.
I made some notes. I just wanted you to respond. We've had more than a year of media anti-Russian narratives, which serves to line the pockets of corporate crony politicians and the coffers of the military contractors, but stifles the voices of ordinary people who haven't had a raise since 1973, technically, and either have tuned out or migrated to false prophets like Donald Trump. As a result, the Democratic Party has imploded at every level over the past 8 years: state, city, congressional, gubernatorial, Senate, apparently with no help from Russian hackers. Further, the current alliance of the Democratic establishment with the CIA and the FBI is bound to erode over time, with these agencies eventually reverting back to their traditional ties with the GOP, leaving Democrats even more vulnerable than they already are.
Would you mind if I interrupted?
And let me ask the question.
Yes,
Julian
please.
Assange says that the Democratic Party is doomed. Should progressives be starting their own party under those circumstances?
Julian Assange says, oh my God, the truth, finally. One of the most compulsive, disgusting liars on the payroll of the Soviet, now Russian
Well,
government.
what about the question?
Well, you just quoted Julian Assange, so excuse me for reacting. The answer is the Democratic Party in November of 2018 will be roaring back and will take back the House and be ready to start an impeachment proceeding against Donald Trump. Having said that, I have a lot of criticism for this leadership of the Democratic Party not speaking to issues that working families care about, but that's for another book and another occasion. But thank you. But I'm sorry for my reaction to Julian Assange, but he is the most disgusting individual. Put aside that he's in jail and in an embassy for child molestation, and he can't leave the embassy at least until he faces a court someday. But
I think ladies first.
oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were done over here.
Thank you. I agree
Sorry.
that it seems pretty obvious that what Comey did tipped the election. However, I don't think we should underestimate what's on the other side, which is Trump, and that there was obviously a double standard. And if something comparable came out, in my view, about Trump, I don't think it likely would have had the same effect, because Trump is like Teflon. Used to say that about Reagan, and I think Trump, it's like exponentially, higher. He's talking about if he shot somebody, and so I just don't think we should underestimate that Comey's effect had that effect, because she was held to a double standard, and if something comparable had come out about Trump, it possibly would have had no effect. But my other question is, how do you sort out, the Comey effect and, the polling data, which obviously you've spent a lot of good time looking at, with, that looking especially at how people lied about Trump and how he's a phenomenon that's pretty different than what has been experienced. How do you, tease out that since it was so close to the actual election, that it's possible that there would have been some downward turn anyway, although I realize 78,000 votes out of millions is not very many.
Well, first, there was a downward turn before the Comey letter, and people have used that in some of my television interviews who read Nate Silver and other analysts. So going into the 28th, Hillary's lead slipped a couple of points. People have used that to say, well, she was slipping anyway. But what was happening in the Republican vote in rural areas was Republicans were coming home because they didn't like Hillary Clinton, and they were holding their noses and voting for a Republican. Republican voters historically are more loyal as party voters than Democrats by about 5 or 10%. So Democrats vote for Democratic presidential candidates by about 80 to 85% historically, going back pre-Franklin Roosevelt. Republicans historically vote for Republican presidential candidates, self-identified Republicans in polls, by 90 or 95%. So what was happening and happened to Barack Obama when Romney was coming back is Republicans tend to come home when they don't like their candidate, they don't like the Democratic candidate, and they come home. So that was a movement that we saw happening in the Clinton campaign, that Trump was closing the gap, not because it was Donald Trump, but because Republicans were coming home. Having said that, it is still a remarkable fact that no one has disputed in all my television interviews or anyone here tonight, that on the morning of October 28th, with all that people say she did wrong, at that moment, she was winning by a larger margin than Barack Obama was winning Romney with 10 days to go. Now, you could say, well, the Trump voters were energized in the last 10 days. And the Hillary Clinton voters were the opposite because of the headlines on criminal investigation. But the panel study, to me, I hope you'll read my book on that, look for the index panel study, is the most interesting thing I stumbled across to figure out what really happened. It was only a turn of 3 or 4%. If you take plus 4% and go to minus 4%, that's a swing of 8%. On that panel, there was a swing of 8% in 10 days. And what was happening was the soft Democrats and the undecideds were staying at home because they didn't want to see a president of the United States under criminal investigation for 4 years, and that's what they all thought after Comey. By the way, on minority turnout, to puncture a myth that is sometimes comical because it's said so often, you assume it's true, Hillary Clinton had a lower turnout than Barack Obama among African Americans. And that's because she didn't arouse the passion of poor people and African Americans in urban areas. How many times have you heard that? Guess what? First of all, the fact that an African American gets a better African American turnout, Joe Lieberman got a bigger Jewish turnout, I can tell you that, should not surprise anyone. People are tribal and do have pride in their ethnic, racial identities. Surprise. Guess what the difference, I want to ask guess what the difference in turnout between Hillary Clinton's turnout in African American communities in 2016 after the Comey letter and Barack Obama in 2012. Anybody want to guess? 2%. 2%. The gentleman who said that there was a low turnout, 2%. And she was a white lady, and Barack Obama was a great, probably one of the greatest candidates in history as a presidential personality, maybe other than Bill Clinton. The two of them are close. So she didn't do so bad among minority voters, and a lot of those minority voters and working class voters who are not activist voters stayed home because they didn't want to watch a president being criminally investigated for the next 4 years.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's my recollection that the State Department Inspector General's investigation of the emails revealed an email from Cheryl Mills that told the people at State there was going to be no further discussion about the emails in the server. What would Mrs. Clinton say to State Department employees who were deposed later on and said to the investigators, if this is all about her, why am I being deposed?
Well, first of all, if Cheryl Mills said exactly those words and you weren't taking them out of context, I would say she did a very poor job because there was a lot of discussion after she wrote that email. Secondly, she was talking about a particular incident involving what she thought was sensitive information. And if you look at the whole string of emails, that's her explanation. But I can assure you that her desire for the emails not to be discussed because she wanted Hillary Clinton's private email system to remain private was no different than Colin Powell told all of his assistants when he went around the State Department system and used AOL. By the way, guess what email server was hacked by the Russians and the Chinese more times than any email server in Washington? Take one guess. State Department? Wait a minute. But Hillary Clinton was supposed to use the State Department server. Republicans said she was a traitor for using a private server. James Comey hired the most brilliant IT forensic technicians to look for a scratch, a tiny breach of hack on that private server. Had they found one, can you imagine what the Republicans would have done? What did he say in that July 5th press conference? By the way, while there is a possibility that there was some hacking of Hillary Clinton's server, comma, I love the word while possibility, we found no evidence of any hacking. No evidence? Well, what are all these Republicans talking about? The State Department server was an open book to the Russians, and all this time they couldn't find any evidence that Hillary Clinton's private server had ever been hacked. Just a strange conclusion after all that hullabaloo. Last question.
It's probably an oversimplification, but can you comment on the phrase that Donald Trump was elected by rural white America?
It's not entirely fair. There were a lot of urban white and some minority voters that voted for Donald Trump. And I want to sort of go against all the orthodoxy I hear in the room and hear in my own voice to tell you that there are things that Donald Trump did that were brilliant. Maybe in spite of his madness, he actually figured out that there is a strain in America that is nativist, anti-immigrant, I won't say racist or bigoted, but certainly a lot of fear about white America losing out to non-white America in some communities that are not racist but are fearful. And he tapped into that anxiety, that fear, and working class voters did identify with him at the end of the day, God knows why, given this billionaire madman, more than they did a Democratic Party going back to FDR that was supposed to be the working family party. So we do have to figure this out. And just remember one thing. If in the Clinton White House, I had come in one morning and people were high-fiving that popularity ratings have gone up as Donald Trump bragged on Twitter when he hit 40% approval. The lowest approval rating in American history for a one-year president since polling was invented is 40%. Yet they were high-fiving that they got to 40%. So the Donald Trump base is very real, it's very intense, and we ought to take it seriously and figure out why. But it's still 40%. and the good people of this country now see what they've gotten in the White House. I think Democrats have to get back on a message that's positive. If anything I had to look back on is that Hillary Clinton was ready to go positive in the last 2 weeks of her campaign to tell her life story, the one that I knew about when I first met her 47 years ago. Funny, down to earth, great friend, caring person, and she did not come across that way as a candidate. They wanted to reintroduce the Hillary Rodham that we've all known through the years, the last 2 weeks of the campaign. I've seen the spots. They were ready to drench the airways, and Comey's letter hit, and everything was about a criminal investigation, and they could not run those ads. So history is what history is. I've written my book. Judge it for what it is, and I especially thank all of you for putting up with all of my opinions. Thank you.